My name is Carly, and I am a gatekeeper and soother of the system. Yeah, and I'm trying to be shy. Yes, that makes sense. Yes, I'm trying to be the thing I'm not trying to be. I am shy, so, you know. But, wanted to remind you before I started reading that there is a link down below in the description. It is a GoFundMe, and yeah, I'm already disassociated. I can tell this is going to be a fun read today. Yeah, again, hi, it's Carly, and we're gonna continue the second Harry Potter book. So let's just hope the internet is nice this time and doesn't cut out and give me technical difficulties. Okay, I did not mark where we were. Oh, geez. Okay, I can probably find where we were. Okay, I'm just gonna start at a random place that I think that is very close. Right, we're the gnomings. Okay, I'm just gonna start on this page. Harry looked at the cover of Mrs. Weasley's book. Written across it in fancy gold letters were the words Gilderoy Lockhart's Guide to Household Pests. There was a big photo. Wow, I'm already. Yeah. There was a big photograph on the front of a very good looking wizard with wavy blonde hair and bright blue eyes. As always, in the wizarding world, the photograph was moving. The wizard, who Harry supposed was Gilderoy Lockhart, kept winking cheekily up at them all. Mrs. Weasley beamed down at him. "Oh, isn't he marvelous?" she said. "He knows his household pests all right. It's a wonderful book." "Mum fancies him," said Fred, and in a very audible whisper. "Don't be ridiculous, Fred," said Mrs. Weasley, her cheeks rather pink. "All right, if you think you know better than Lockhart, you can go and get on with it, and woe betide you if there is a single gnome in the garden when I come out to inspect it." Yawning and grumbling, the Weasleys slouched outside with Harry behind them. The garden was large and in Harry's eyes exactly what a garden should be. The Dursleys wouldn't have liked it. There were plenty of weeds, and the grass needed cutting, but there were gnarled trees all around the walls, plants Harry had never even seen from before, spilling from every flower bed, and a big green pond full of frogs. "Muggles have garden gnomes too, you know," Harry told Ron as they crossed the lawn. "Yeah, I've seen those things they think are gnomes," said Ron, bent double with his head in a peony bush, like fat little Santa Clauses with fishing rods. There was a violent scuffling noise. The peony bush shuddered, and Ron straightened. "This is a gnome," he said grimly. "Get off me! Get off me!" squealed the gnome. It was certainly nothing like Santa Claus. It was small and leathery looking, with a large, knobby, bald head exactly like a potato. Ron held it at arm's length as it kicked out at him with its horny little feet. He grasped at it around the ankles and turned it upside down. "This is what you have to do," he said. He raised the gnome above his head. "Get off me!" and started to swing it in great circles like a lasso. Seeing the shocked look on Harry's face, Ron added, "It doesn't hurt them. You've just got to make them really dizzy so they can't find their way back to the gnome holes." He let go of the gnome's ankles. It flew 20 feet into the air and landed with a thud in the field over the hedge. "Pitiful," said Fred. "I bet I can get mine beyond that stump." Harry learned rather quickly not to feel too sorry for the gnomes. He decided just to drop the first one he caught over the hedge, but the gnome, sensing weakness, sank its razor-sharp teeth into Harry's finger, and he had a hard job shaking it off until, "Wow, Harry, that must have been 50 feet!" The air was soon thick with flying gnomes. "See, they're not too bright," said George, seizing 5 or 6 gnomes at once. "The moment they know the denoming's going on, they storm up to have a look. You'd think they've learned now just to stay put." Soon, the crowd of gnomes in the field started walking away in a straggling line, their little shoulders hunched. "They'll be back," said Ron as they watched the gnomes disappear into the hedge on the other side of the field. "They love it here. Dad's too soft with them. He thinks they're funny." Just then, the front door slammed. "He's back," said George. "Dad's home." They hurried through the garden and back into the house. Mrs. Weasley was slumped in a kitchen chair with her glasses off, and her Mr. Weasley was slumped in a kitchen chair with his glasses off and his eyes closed. He was a thin man, going bald, but the little hair he had was as red as his children. He was wearing long green robes, which were dusty and travel-worn. "What a night," he mumbled, groping for the teapot as they all sat around him. "9 raids, 9, and an old An old Mundungus Fletcher tried to put a hex on me when I had my back turned. Mr. Weasley took a gulp of tea and sighed. Find anything, Dad? Said Fred eagerly. All I got were a few shrinking door keys and a biting kettle, yawned Mr. Weasley. There was some pretty nasty stuff that wasn't my department, though. Mortlake was taken away for questioning about some extremely odd ferrets, but that's the Committee of Experimental Charms, thank goodness. Why would anyone bother making someone's door keys shrink? Said George. Just muggle baiting, sighed Mr. Weasley. Sell them a key that keeps shrinking to nothing so they can't find it when they need it. Of course, it's very hard to convince anyone because no muggle would admit their key keeps shrinking. They'll insist they just keep losing them. Bless them. They'll go to any lengths to ignore magic, even if it's staring them in the face. But the things our lot have taken to enchanting you wouldn't believe, like cars, for instance. Mrs. Weasley had appeared, holding a long poker like a sword. Mr. Weasley's eyes jerked open. He stared guiltily at his wife. Cars, Molly dear? Yes, Arthur, cars, said Mrs. Weasley, her eyes flashing. Imagine a wizard buying a rusty old car and telling his wife all he wanted to do was take it apart to see how it works, while really he was enchanting it to make it fly. Mr. Weasley blinked. Well, dear, I think you'll find that he would be quite within the law to do that, even if he maybe would have done better to tell his wife the truth. There's a loophole in the law, you'll find, as long as he wasn't intending to fly the car. The fact that the car could fly wouldn't. Arthur Weasley, you made sure there was a loophole when you wrote that law, shouted Mrs. Weasley, just so you could carry on tinkering with all that muggle rubbish in your shed. And for your information, Harry arrived in the morning in that car you weren't intending to fly. Harry? Said Mr. Weasley blankly. Harry who? He looked around, saw Harry, and jumped. Good Lord, it is Harry Potter. Very pleased to meet you. Ron's told us so much about your sons flew that car to Harry's house and back last night, shouted Mrs. Weasley. What have you got to say about that, eh? Did you really? Said Mr. Weasley eagerly. Did it go all right? I mean, he faltered as sparks flew from Mrs. Weasley's eyes. Sorry, there's a dog right beside me. I don't know who decided to take the puppers out, but okay. He faltered as sparks flew from Mrs. Weasley's eyes. That wasn't very wrong of you boys. Very wrong indeed. Let's leave them to it, Ron muttered to Harry as Mrs. Weasley swelled like a bullfrog. Come on, I'll show you to my bedroom. They slipped out of the kitchen and down a narrow passageway to an uneven staircase which wound its way zigzagging up through the house. On the third landing, a door stood ajar. Harry just caught sight of a pair of bright brown eyes staring at him before it closed with a snap. Jenny, said Ron, you don't know how weird it is for her to be this shy. She never normally shuts up. They climbed 2 more flights until they reached a door with peeling paint and a small plaque on it saying Ronald's room. Harry stepped in, his head almost touching the top of the ceiling, and blinked. It was like walking to a furnace. Nearly everything in Ron's room seemed to be a violent shade of orange. The bedspread, the walls, even the ceiling. Then Harry realized that Ron had covered nearly every inch of the shabby wallpaper with posters of the same 7 witches and wizards, all wearing bright orange robes, carrying broomsticks, and waving energetically. Your Quidditch team? Said Harry. The Chudley Cannon, said Ron, pointing at the orange bedspread, which was emblazoned with 2 giant black C's and a speeding cannonball. 9th in the league. Ron's spell books were stacked untidily in a corner next to the pile of comics that seemed to all feature the adventures of Martin Miggs, the Mad Muggle. Ron's magic wand was laying on top of a fish tank full of frog spawn on the windowsill, next to his fat gray rat, Scabbers, who was snoozing in a patch of sun. Harry stepped over a pack of self-shuffling playing cards on the floor and looked out of the tiny window. In the field far below, he could see a gang of gnomes sneaking one by one back through the Weasley's hedge. Then he turned to look at Ron, who was watching him almost nervously, as though waiting for his opinion. It's a bit small, said Ron quickly. Not like the room that you had with the muggles, and I'm right underneath the ghoul in the attic. He's always banging on the pipes and groaning. But Harry, grinning widely, said, "This is the best house I've ever been in." Ron's ears went pink. Chapter 4. At Flourish and Blots. Life at the Burrow was as different as possible from life on Privet Drive. The Dursleys liked everything neat and ordered. The Weasleys' house burst with strange and unexpected. Harry got a shock the first time he looked in the mirror over the kitchen mantelpiece, and it shouted, "Tuck your shirt in, Scruffy." The ghoul in the attic howled and dropped pipes whenever he felt things were getting too quiet, and small explosions from Fred and George's bedroom were considered perfectly normal. What Harry found most unusual about life at Ron's, however, wasn't the talking mirror or the clanking ghoul. It was the fact that everybody there seemed to like him. I'm going to take a sip of my cocoa, sorry. Okay. Mrs. Weasley fussed over the state of his socks and tried to force him to eat 4 helpings at every meal. Mr. Weasley liked Harry to sit next to him at the dinner table so that he could bombard him with questions about life of the Muggles, asking him to explain how things like plugs and the postal service worked. "Fascinating," he would say as Harry talked him through using a telephone. "Ingenious, really. How many ways Muggles have found of getting along without magic." Harry heard from Hogwarts one sunny morning about a week after he had arrived at the Burrow. He and Ron went down to breakfast to find Mr. and Mrs. Weasley and Ginny already sitting at the kitchen table. The moment she saw Harry, Ginny accidentally knocked her porridge bowl on the floor with a loud clatter. Ginny seemed very prone to knocking things over whenever Harry entered a room. She dived under the table to retrieve the bowl and emerged with her face glowing like a setting sun. Pretending he hadn't noticed this, Harry sat down and took the toast Mrs. Weasley offered him. "Letters from school," said Mr. Weasley, passing Harry and Ron identical envelopes of yellowish parchment, addressed and greening. "Dumbledore already knows you're here, Harry. Doesn't miss a trick, that man. You've got them. You two have got them too," he added, as Fred and George ambled in, still in their pajamas. For a few minutes there was silence as they read their letters. Harry told him to catch the Hogwarts Express as usual. From King's Cross Station on September 1st. There is also a list of the new books he'd need for the coming year. Second-year students will require The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 2 by Miranda Goshawk, Break with a Banshee by Gilderoy Lockhart. Oh, God. Gadding with Ghouls by Gilderoy Lockhart. Holiday with Hags by Gilderoy Lockhart. Travels with Trolls by Gilderoy Lockhart. Voyages with Vampires by Gilderoy Lockhart. Wandering with Werewolves by Gilderoy Lockhart. And Year with the Yeti by Gilderoy Lockhart. Jeez, there's a lot of books by him. It's also they also sound like Goosebump books, or like books like you would find in like the young adult section that are like the horror, like the Goosebump section for some reason. Like I always think about that. There was a book series that James read as a kid, and he was very obsessed with them. But they remind me of that. Fred, who had finished his own list, peered over at Harry's. "You've been told to get all Lockhart's books too," he said. "The new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher must be a fan. Bet it's a witch." At this point, Fred caught his mother's eye and quickly busied himself with the marmalade. "That lot won't come cheap," said George with a quick look at his parents. "Lockhart's books are really expensive." "Well, we'll manage," said Mrs. Weasley, but she looked worried. "I expect we'll be able to pick up a lot of Ginny's things secondhand." "Oh, you're starting at Hogwarts this year?" Harry asked Ginny. She nodded, blushing to the roots of her flaming hair, and put her elbow in the butter dish. Fortunately, no one saw this except Harry, because just then Ron's elder brother, Percy, walked in. He was already dressed, his Hogwarts prefect badge pinned to his sweater vest. "Morning, all," said Percy briskly. "Lovely day." To live with someone like that. He sat down in the only remaining chair, but leapt up again almost immediately, pulling from underneath him a molten gray feather duster. At least, that was what Harry thought it was, until he saw that it was breathing. "Errol!" said Ron, taking the limp owl from Percy and extracting a letter from under its wing. "Finally, got Hermione's answer. I wrote to her saying we were going to try and rescue you from the Dursleys." He carried Errol to a perch just inside the back door and tried to stand him up. But Errol flopped straight off again, so hiccups. Ron lay him on the draining board instead, muttering, pathetic. Then he ripped open Hermione's letter and read it aloud. Dear Ron and Harry, if you're there, I hope everything went all right, and then that Harry is okay, and that you didn't do anything illegal to get him out, Ron, because that would get Harry into trouble too. I've been really worried about, and if Harry is all right, will you please let me know at once? But perhaps it would be better if you use a different owl, because I think another delivery might finish your one off. I'm very busy with schoolwork, of course. How can she be? Said Ron in horror. We're on vacation. And we're going to London the next Wednesday to buy many books. Why don't we meet in Diagon Alley? Let me know what's happening as soon as you can. Love, from Hermione. Well, that fits nicely. We can go and I'll get your things then, too, said Mrs. Weasley, starting to clear the table. What are you all up to today? Harry, Ron, Fred, and George were planning to go up the hill to a small paddock the Weasleys owned. It was surrounded by trees that blocked it from view of the village below, meaning that they could practice Quidditch there as long as they didn't fly too high. They couldn't use real Quidditch balls, which would have been hard to explain if they had escaped and flown over the village. Instead, they threw apples for one another to catch. They took turns riding Harry's Nimbus 2000, which was easily the best broom. Ron's old shooting star was often outshit by passing butterflies. I'm sorry, I'm just picturing that. 5 minutes later, they were marching up the hill, broomsticks over their shoulder. They had asked Percy if he wanted to join them, but said he was too busy. Harry had only seen Percy at mealtimes so far. He had stayed shut in his room for the rest of the time. Wish I knew what he was up to, said Fred, frowning. He's not himself. His exam results came the other day before you did. 12 owls. He hardly gloated at all. Ordinary wizarding levels, George explained, seeing Harry's puzzled look. Bill got 12 too. If we're not careful, we'll have another head boy in the family. I don't think I could stand the shame. Bill was the oldest Weasley brother. He and the next brother, Charlie, had already left Hogwarts. Harry had never met either of them, but he knew that Charlie was in Romania studying dragons, and Bill in Egypt working for the Wizards Bank Gringotts. Don't know how Mom and Dad are going to afford all of our school stuff this year, said George after a while. 5 sets of Lockhart books, and Ginny needs robes and a wand and everything. Harry said nothing. He felt a bit awkward. Stored in an underground vault at Gringotts in London was a small fortune that his parents had left him. Of course, it was only in the wizarding world that he had money. You couldn't use galleon sickles and nuts in mug shops. Is it nuts or knuts? Like, I always called them knuts as a kid, but now I call them nuts. You know what? I don't know. He had never mentioned his Gringotts bank account to the Dursleys. He didn't think their horror of anything connected with magic was stretched to a large pile of gold. Mrs. Weasley woke them all early the following Wednesday. After a quick half a dozen bacon sandwiches each, they pulled on their coats, and Mrs. Weasley took a flower pot off the kitchen mantel and peered inside. We're running low, Arthur, she sighed. We'll have to buy some more today. Ah, well, guess first. After you, Harry, dear. She offered him the flower pot. Harry stared at them, all watching him. What am I supposed to do? He stammered. He's never traveled by Floo powder, said Ron suddenly. Sorry, Harry, I forgot. Never, said Mr. Weasley. But how did you get to Diagon Alley to buy your school things last year? I went on the underground. Really? Said Mr. Weasley eagerly. Were there escapadors? How exactly? I'm pretty sure he means escalators, but okay. Not now, Arthur, said Mrs. Weasley. Floo powder's a lot quicker, dear, but goodness me, if you've never used it before. He'll be all right, Mum, said Fred. Harry, watch us first. He took a pinch of glittering powder of the flower pot, stepped into the fire, and threw the powder into the flames. With a roar, the fire turned emerald green and rose higher than Fred, who stepped right into it, shouted Diagon Alley, and vanished. You must speak very clearly, dear, said Mrs. Weasley. Mrs. Weasley told Harry as George dipped his hand into the flower pot. And be sure to get out of the right at the right grate. The right what? Said Harry nervously as the fire roared and whipped George out of the sight, too. Well, there are an awful lot of wizard fires to choose from. You know, as long as you've spoken clearly. He'll be fine, Molly. Don't fuss, said Mr. Weasley, helping himself to Floo powder, too. But, dear, if he gets lost, how would he ever explain to his aunt and uncle? They wouldn't mind, he reassured her. Dudley would think it was a brilliant joke if I got lost up a chimney. Don't worry about that. Well, all right. You go after Arthur, said Mrs. Weasley. Now, when you get into the fire, say where you're going. And keep your elbows tucked in, Ron advised. And your eyes shut, said Mrs. Weasley. The soot. Don't fidget, said Ron, or you might, well, fall out of the wrong fireplace. And don't panic and get out too early. Wait until you see Fred and George. Trying hard to bear all this in mind, Harry took a pinch of Floo powder and walked to the edge of the fire. He took a deep breath, scattered the powder into the flames, and stepped in. The fire immediately felt like a warm breeze. He opened his mouth and immediately swallowed a lot of hot ash. Dick, I gone alley, he coughed. It felt as though he was being sucked down a giant drain. He seemed to be spinning very fast. The roaring in his ears was deafening. He tried to keep his eyes open, but the whirl of green flames made him feel sick. Something hard knocked his elbow, and he tucked it in tightly, still spinning and spinning. Now it felt as though cold hands were slapping his face. Squinting through the glasses, he saw a blurred stream of fireplaces and snatched glimpses of room beyond. His bacon sandwiches were turning inside him. He closed his eyes again, wishing it would stop, and then he fell face forward onto cold stone and felt the bridge of his glasses snap. Dizzy and bruised, covered in soot, he got up gingerly to his feet. Holding his broken glasses up to his eyes, he was quite alone, but where he was, he had no idea. All he could tell was that he was standing in front of in the stone fireplace of what looked like a large, dimly lit wizard shop. But nothing in here was ever likely to be on a Hogwarts school list. A glass case nearby held a withered hand on a cushion, a blood-stained pack of cards, and a staring glass eye. Evil-looking masks stared down from the walls. An assortment of human bones lay upon the counter, and rusty, spiked instruments hung from the ceiling. Even worse, the dark, narrow street Harry could see through the dusty shop window was definitely not Diagon Alley. The sooner he got out of here, the better. Nose still stinging where it had hit the hearth. Harry made his way swiftly and silently towards the door. But before he got halfway towards it, two people appeared on the other side of the glass. And one of them was the very last person Harry wanted to meet when he was lost, covered in soot, and wearing broken glasses. Draco Malfoy. Harry looked quickly around and spotted a large black cabinet to his left. He shot inside it and pulled the doors closed, leaving a small crack to peer through. Seconds later, a bell clanged and Malfoy stepped into the shop. The man who followed could only be Draco's father. He had the same pale, pointed, and identical cold gray face and identical cold gray eyes. Mr. Malfoy crossed the shop, looking lazily at the items on display, and rang a bell on the counter before turning to his son and saying, "Touch nothing, Draco." Malfoy, who had reached for the glass eye, said, "I thought you were going to buy me a present." "I said I would buy you a racing broom," said his father, drumming his fingers on the counter. "What's that good of that if I'm not on the house team?" said Malfoy, looking sulkily and bad-tempered. "Harry Potter got a Nimbus 2000 last year, special permission from Dumbledore, so he can play for Gryffindor. He's not even that good. It's just because he's famous. Famous for having a stupid scar on his forehead." Malfoy bent down to examine a shelf full of skulls. "Everyone thinks he's so smart. Wonderful Potter with his scar and his broomstick." Uh, why is this like he's just so jealous? It's kind of adorable. Like I can't even. You have told me all you. Okay, but the amount of times Draco talks about Harry. Okay, sorry. "You have told me this at least a dozen times already," said Mr. Malfoy with a quelling look at his son. "And I would remind you this is not prudent to appear less than fond of Harry Potter, not that most of our kind regard him as a hero not when most of our kind regards him as the hero who made the Dark Lord disappear. Ah, Mr. Borgin." A stooping man had appeared behind the counter, smoothing his greasy black hair from his face. "Mr. Malfoy, what a pleasure to see you again," said Mr. Borgin, in a voice as oily as his hair. "Delighted. And young Master Malfoy, too, charmed. How may I be of assistance? I must show you, just in today, and very reasonably priced." "I'm not buying today, Mr. Borgin, but selling," said Mr. Malfoy. "Selling?" The smile faded slightly from Mr. Borgin's face. You have heard, of course, the ministry is conducting more raids, and Mr. Malfoy taking the roll of parchment from inside his pocket and unraveling it for Mr. Bolton to read. I have a few items at home that might embarrass me if the minister were to call. Mr. Borgin fixed a pair of pincers to his nose and looked down the list. The ministry would presume to trouble you, sir, surely. Wouldn't presume to trouble you, sir, surely. Mr. Malfoy's lip curled. I have not been visited yet. The name Malfoy still demands a certain respect. Yet the ministry grows more and more meddlesome. There are rumors about a new Muggle Protection Act. No doubt the fleet Muggle-loving fool Arthur Weasley is behind it. Harry felt a hot surge of anger. And as you see, some of these poisons might make it appear. I understand, sir, of course, said Mr. Borgin. Let me see. Can I have that? Interrupted Draco, pointing at the withered hand on its cushion. Are you okay, Greta? Did he just shake away? Oh, poor baby. Sorry, the dog. The Hand of Glory, said Mr. Borgin, abandoning Mr. Malfoy's list and scurrying over to Draco. Insert a candle in, and it gives light only to the holder. Best friends of thieves and plunderers. Your son has fine taste, sir. I hope my son will amount to more than a thief or a plunderer, Borgin, said Mr. Malfoy coldly, and Mr. Borgin said quickly, no offense, sir, no offense meant. Though, if his grades don't pick up, said Mr. Malfoy, more coldly still, that may indeed be all he is fit for. It's not my fault, retorted Draco. The teachers all have favorites, that Hermione Granger. I would have thought you'd be ashamed that a girl of no wizard family beat you in every exam, snapped Mr. Malfoy. Ha! Said Harry under his breath, pleased to see Draco looking both ashamed and angry. It's the same all over, said Mr. Borgin in his oily voice. Wizard blood is counted for less and less everywhere. Not with me, said Mr. Malfoy, his long nostrils flaring. No, sir, nor with me, sir, said Borgin with a deep bow. In that case, perhaps we can return to my list, said Mr. Malfoy shortly. I'm in somewhat of a hurry, Miss Borgin. I have important business elsewhere today. They started to haggle. Harry watched nervously as Draco drew nearer and nearer to his hiding place, examining the objects for sale. Draco paused to examine a long coil of hangman's rope to read, smirking, the card propped on a magnificent necklace of opals. Caution, do not touch, cursed, has claimed lives of 19 Muggle owners to date. Draco turned away and saw the cabinet right in front of him. He walked forward. He stretched out his hand for the handle. Done, said Mr. Malfoy on the counter. Come on, Draco. Harry wiped his forehead on his sleeve as Draco turned away. Good day to you, Mr. Borgin. I'll expect you at the manor tomorrow to pick up the goods. The moment the door had closed, Mr. Borgin dropped his oily manner. Good day yourself, Mr. Malfoy. And if the stories are true, you haven't sold me half of what's hidden in your manor. Muttering darkly, Mr. Borgin disappeared to a back room. Harry waited for a minute in case he came back, then, quietly as he could, slipped out of the cabinet, past the glass cases, and out of the shop door. Clutching his broken glasses to his face, Harry stared around. He had emerged into a dingy alleyway that seemed to be made up entirely of shops devoted to the dark arts. The one he had just left, Borgin and Burke's, looked like the largest, but opposite was a nasty window display of shrunken heads, and 2 doors down, a large cage was alive with gigantic black spiders. 2 shabby-looking wizards were watching him from the shadows of a doorway, muttering to each other. Feeling jumpy, Harry set off, trying to hold his glasses on straight, and hoping against hope he'd be able to find a way out of here. An old wooden street sign hanging over a shop selling poisonous candles told him he was in Nocturne Alley. This didn't help, as Harry had never heard of such a place. He supposed he hadn't spoken clearly enough through his mouthful of ashes back in the Weasley's fire. Trying to stay calm, he wondered what to do. Not lost, are you, my dear? Said a voice in his ear, making him jump. An aged witch stood in front of him, holding a tray of what looked horribly like whole human fingers. She leered at him, showing mossy teeth. Harry backed away. I'm fine, thanks, he said. I'm just... Harry, what do you think you're doing down there? Harry's heart leapt. So did the witch. A load of fingernails cascading down on her feet, and she cursed as the massive form of Hagrid, the Hogwarts gamekeeper, came striding down them towards them, beetle-black eyes flashing over his great bristling beard. Hagrid! Harry croaked in relief. I was lost! Blue powder! Harry seized Harry by the scruff of his neck and pulled him away from the witch, knocking the tray right out of her hands. Her shrieks followed them all the way along the twisting alleyways out into the bright sunlight. Harry saw a familiar snow-white marble building in the distance, Gringotts Bank. Hagrid had steered him right into Diagon Alley. You're a mess, said Hagrid gruffly, brushing soot off Harry so forcefully he nearly knocked him into a barrel of dragon dung outside of Apothecary. Skulking around Nocturne Alley? I don't know a dodgy place, Harry. Don't want no one to see you down there. I realize that, said Harry, ducking as Hagrid made to brush him off again. I told you I was lost. What were you doing down there anyway? I was looking for a flesh-eating repellent, growled Hagrid. They're ruining the school's cabbages. You're not on your own. I'm staying with the Weasleys, but we got separated, Harry exclaimed. I've got to go and find them. They set off together down the street. Hold on, give me a sec. Sorry, I'm checking how many pages. Okay, yeah, I think I can get past that. Sorry, I'm just trying to see how long I could keep going. Right. How come you never wrote me back to me? Said Hagrid as Harry jogged alongside him. He had to take 3 steps to every stride of Hagrid's enormous boots. Harry explained all about Dobby and the Dursleys. Lousy muggles, growled Hagrid. If I'd know. Harry, over here! Harry looked up and saw Hermione Granger standing on the top of the white flight of steps at Gringotts. She ran down to meet them, her bushy brown hair flying behind her. What happened to your glasses? Hello, Hagrid. Oh, it's wonderful to see you two again. Are you coming into Gringotts, Harry? As soon as I found the Weasleys, said Harry. You won't have to wait long, said Hagrid said with a grin. Harry and Hermione looked around, sprinting up the crowded street where Ron, Fred, George, Percy, and Mr. Weasley. Harry! Mr. Weasley panted. We hoped you'd have only gone one grade too far, he mopped his glistening bald patch. Molly's frantic. She's coming now. Where'd you come out? Ron asked. Nocturne Alley, said Hagrid grimly. Excellent, said Fred and George together. We've never been allowed in, said Ron enviously. I should ready well not think not, growled Hagrid. Mrs. Weasley now came galloping into view, her handbag swinging wildly in one hand. Ginny was clinging on to the other. Oh, Harry, oh, my dear, you could have been anywhere. Gasping for breath, she pulled a large cloth brush off of her and began sweeping off the soot. Hagrid had managed to be away. Mr. Weasley took Harry's glasses, gave them a tap of his wand, and returned them, good as new. Well, association. Well, gotta be off, said Hagrid, who was having his hand wrung by Mrs. Weasley. Nocturne Alley, you hadn't found him, Hagrid. See you at Hogwarts. And he strode away, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the packed tree. Guess who I saw in Borgin and Burke's? Harry asked Ron and Hermione as they climbed the Gringotts steps. Malfoy and his father. Did Lucius Malfoy buy anything? Said Mr. Weasley sharply behind them. No, he was selling. So he's worried, said Mr. Weasley with a grim satisfaction. Oh, I'd love to get Lucius Malfoy for something. You be careful, Arthur, said Mrs. Weasley sharply, as they were bowed into the bank by a goblin at its door. That's family's trouble. Don't go biting off more than you can chew. So you don't think I'm a match for Lucius Malfoy, said Mr. Weasley indignantly, but he was distracted almost at once by the sight of Hermione's parents, who were standing nervously at the counter. That ran all along the great marble hall, waiting for Hermione to introduce them. But you're muggles, said Mr. Weasley delightedly. We must have a drink. What's that you've got there? Oh, you're changing muggle money. Molly, look. He pointed excitedly at the 10-pound notes in Mr. Granger's hand. Meet you back here, Ron said to Hermione, as the Weasleys and Harry were led off to the underground vault by another Green Dots goblin. The vaults were reached by means of small goblin-driven carts that sped along miniature train tracks through the bank's underground tunnels. Harry enjoyed the breakneck journey down to the Weasleys' vault, but felt dreadful, far worse than he had in Nocturnally when it opened. There was a very small pile of silver sickles inside, and just one gold galleon. Mr. Weasley felt right into the corners before sweeping the whole lot into her bag. Harry felt even worse when they reached his vault. He tried to block the contents from view, but as he hastily shoved handfuls of coin into a leather bag. Back outside, on the marble steps they all separated, Percy muttering vaguely about needing a new quill. Fred and George had spotted their friend from Hogwarts, Lee Jordan. Mrs. Weasley and Ginny was going to the second-hand robe shop. Mr. Weasley was insisting on taking the Grangers off to the Leaky Cauldron for a drink. "We'll all meet at the Flourish and Blossom in an hour to buy your school books," said Mrs. Weasley, setting off with Ginny. "And not one step down Nocturne Alley," she shouted at the twins' retreating backs. Harry, Ron, and Hermione strolled off along the winding cobbled street. The bag of gold and silver and bronze, jingling cheerfully in Harry's pocket, was clamoring to be spent. So he brought 3 large strawberry and peanut butter ice creams, which they slurped happily as they wandered up the alley, examining the fascinating shop windows. Ron gazed longingly at a full set of Chudley Cannon robes in the window of quality Quidditch supplies until Hermione dragged them off to buy ink and parchment next door in Gamble and Japes' Wizarding Joke Shop. Next door. I just read that as a complete sentence. I'm sorry. In Gamble and Japes' Wizarding Joke Shop, they met Fred and George and Lee Jordan, who were stocking up on Dr. Filibuster's fabulous Wet Start No Heat fireworks. And in a tiny junk shop full of broken wands, lopsided brass scales, and old clock covered in potions, they found Percy deeply immersed in a small and deeply boring book called Prefects Who Gain Power, a study of Hogwarts prefects and their later careers. Ron read aloud on the book cover. "That sounds fascinating." "Go away," Percy snapped. "Of course, he's very ambitious, Percy. He's got it all planned out. He wants to be a minister of magic," Ron told Harry and Hermione in an undertone as they left Percy to it. An hour later, they headed to a flourish of blocks. There, they were by no means the only ones making their way to a bookshop. As they approached it, they saw, to their great surprise, a large crowd jostling outside the door trying to get in. The reason for this was proclaimed by a large banner stretched across the upper windows. "Gilderoy Lockhart will be signing copies of his autobiography, Magical Me, today, 12:30 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. "We can actually meet him?" Hermione squealed. "I mean, he's written almost the whole book list." The crowd seemed to be made up of mostly witches around Mrs. Weasley's age. A harassed-looking wizard stood at the door, saying, "Calmly, please, ladies. Don't push there. Mind the books now." Harry, Ron, and Hermione squeezed inside. A long line wound right back into the book of the shop, where Gilderoy Lockhart was signing his books. They each grabbed a copy of the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 2, and sneaked up the line to where the rest of the Weasleys were standing, Mr. and Mrs. Granger. "Oh, there you are. Good," said Mrs. Weasley. She sounded breathless and kept patting her hair. "We'll be able to see him in a minute." Gilderoy Lockhart came slowly into view, seated at a table surrounded by large pictures of his own face, all winking and flashing dazzling white teeth at the crowd. The real Lockhart was wearing robes of forget-me-not blue that exactly matched his eyes. I hate that I know his favorite color is lilac. That just popped in my head. I hate that I know because it's just he forces the kids to take a freaking quiz about him, and I remember pretty much most of the answers, and I just remember his favorite color is lilac. I don't like that I know that. Sorry, that was random, but that exactly matched his eyes. His pointed wizard's hat was set at a jaunty angle on his wavy hair. A short, irritable-looking man was dancing around taking photographs with a large black camera that emitted puffs of purple smoke with every blinding flash. "Out of the way there," he snarled at Ron, moving back to get a better shot. "This is for the Daily Prophet." Big deal, said Ron, rubbing his foot where the photographer had stepped on it. Gilderoy Lockhart heard him. He looked up. He saw Ron, and then he saw Harry. He stared. Then he leapt to his feet and positively shouted, "It can't be Harry Potter!" Also, the dad can do a perfect impression of Gilderoy Lockhart, so that's what I'm hearing right now. Gilderoy Lockhart is annoying. It can't be Harry Potter. The crowd parted, whispering excitedly. Lockhart dived forward, seized Harry's arm, and pulled him to the front. The crowd burst into applause. Harry's face burned as Lockhart shook his hand for the photographer, who was clicking away madly, wafting thick smoke over the Weasleys. Nice big smile, Harry, said Lockhart through his own gleaming teeth. Together, you and I are worth the front page. When he finally let go of Harry's hand, Harry could hardly feel his fingers. He tried to sidle back over to the Weasleys, but Lockhart threw an arm around his shoulders and clamped him tightly to his side. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, waving for quiet, "what an extraordinary moment this is! The perfect moment for me to make a little announcement I've been sitting on for some time. When young Harry here stepped into Flourish and Blot today, he only wanted to buy my autobiography, which I shall be happy to present him now, free of charge." The crowd applauded again. He had no idea, Lockhart continued, giving Harry a little shake that made his glasses slip to the end of his nose, "that he would be shortly be getting much, much more than my book, Magical Me. He and his schoolmates will, in fact, be getting the real Magical Me. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I have great pleasure and pride in announcing that this September I will be taking up the post of Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." I know I keep interrupting, I'm sorry, sidebar. There's a picture post that I have that I don't, maybe it was James who saved it. I don't know. Someone saved it, and it was like all I can think that that Dumbledore was thinking when he hired Lockhart to be the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher would be, "Ha! This is going to be hilarious." Because I mean, it really is. It is kind of, and oh my god, no! I'd be the only female student who going, "No, go away. I hate you." Anyway, the crowd cheered and clapped, and Harry found himself being presented with the entire works of Gilderoy Lockhart, staggering slightly under their weight. He managed to make his way out of the limelight to the edge of the room where Ginny was standing next to her new cauldron. "You have these," Harry mumbled to her, tipping the books into the cauldron. "I'll buy my own." "Bet you loved that, Potter, didn't you?" said a voice Harry had no trouble recognizing. He straightened up and found himself face to face with Draco Malfoy, who was wearing his usual sneer. "Famous Harry Potter," said Malfoy. "Can't go into it." Let's go with a British accent. "Can't even go into a bookshop without making the front page." "Leave him alone. He didn't want all that," said Ginny. It was the first time she had spoken in front of Harry. She was glaring at Malfoy. "Potter, you've got yourself a girlfriend," drawled Malfoy. Ginny went scarlet as Ron and Hermione fought their way over, both clutching stacks of Lockhart's books. "Oh, it's you," said Ron, looking at Malfoy as if he were something unpleasant on the sole of his shoe. "Bet you're surprised to see Harry here, eh? Not as surprised as I am to see you in the shop, Weasley," retorted Malfoy. "I suppose your parents will go hungry for a month to pay for all of those." Ron went as red as Ginny. He dropped his books into the cauldron, too, and started towards Malfoy, but Harry and Hermione grabbed the back of his jacket. "Ron," said Mr. Weasley, struggling over with Fred and George. "What are you doing? It's too crowded in here. Let's go outside." "Well, well, well, Arthur Weasley." It was Mr. Malfoy who stood with his hand on Draco's shoulder, sneering just in the same way. Lucius and Mr. Weasley nodded coldly. "Busy time at the Ministry, I hear," said Mr. Malfoy. "All those raids, I hope they're paying you overtime." He reached into Ginny's cauldron and extracted from amid the glossy Lockhart's book a very old, very battered copy of A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration. Obviously not, Mr. Malfoy said. Dear me, what's the use of being a disgrace to the name of the wizard if they don't even pay you well for it? Mr. Weasley flushed darker than either Ron or Ginny. We have a very different idea of what disgraces the name of wizard, Malfoy, he said. Clearly, said Mr. Malfoy, his pale eyes straying to Mr. and Mrs. Granger, who were watching apprehensively. The company you keep, Weasley, and I thought your family could sink no lower. There was a thud of metal as Ginny's cauldron went flying. Mr. Weasley had thrown himself at Mr. Malfoy, knocking him backward into a bookshelf. Dozens of heavy spellbooks came thundering down on all their heads. There was a yell of, "Get him, Dad!" from Fred and George. Mrs. Weasley shrieking, "No, Arthur, no!" The crowd stampeded backwards, knocking more shells over. "Gentlemen, please, please!" cried the assistant, and then louder than all, "Break it up there, gents, break it up!" Hagrid was wading towards them through the sea of books. In an instant, he had pulled Mr. Weasley and Mr. Malfoy apart. Mr. Weasley had a cut lip, and Mr. Malfoy had been hit in the eye with an encyclopedia of toadstools. He was still holding Ginny's old Transfiguration book. He thrust it at her, his eyes glittered with malice. "Here, girl, take your book. It's the best your father can give you." Pulling himself out of Hagrid's grip, he beckoned to Draco and swept from the shop. "You should have ignored him, Arthur," said Hagrid, almost lifting Mr. Weasley off his feet as he straightened his robes. "Rotten to the core, the whole family. Everyone knows that. No Malfoy's worth listening to. Bad blood, that's what it is. Come on now, let's get out of here." The assistant looked as though he wanted to stop them leaving, but he barely came up to Hagrid's waist, and he seemed to think better of it. They hurried up the street, but the Grangers shaking with fright, and Mrs. Weasley decided to choke with fury. "A fine example to set for your kids, brawling in public. What Gilderoy Lockhart must have thought." "He was pleased," said Fred. "Didn't you hear him as we were leaving? He was asking the bloke from the Daily Prophet if he'd be able to work the fight into his report. Said it was all publicity." But it was a subdued group that headed back to the fireside in the Leaky Cauldron, where Harry, the Weasleys, and all their shopping would be traveling back to the Burrow using blue powder. They said goodbye to the Grangers, who were leaving the pub for the Muggle Street on the other side. Mr. Weasley started to ask them how bus stops worked, but stopped quickly at the look on Mrs. Weasley's face. Harry took off his glasses and put them safely in his pocket before helping himself to blue powder. It definitely wasn't his favorite way to travel. All right, well, that's all I'm going to be reading today. I hope you enjoyed your time. Again, my name is Carley, and I wanted to remind you guys that there is a very important GoFundMe link in the description down below. I hope you are having an amazing day and an amazing night. And yeah, all our social media is down there. Anyways, thank you. Good night. As it's literally midnight here. Oh, geez.